Hello, trumpet players. I was gonna do this video outside, but the weather's not good for that today. And, I get a question every once in a while. People say, why do you write the Jazz Etudes? Why do you do that? And I've been doing that, I guess, every year for at least 12 years, I think. I've kind of lost track, but it's been a long time. And most people know that you don't get paid for that, right? And there's not a bunch of reasons for people to actually do that. And so I wanted to share with you my background on the etudes and why I continue to contribute to let's be clear, we're talking about the Texas All-State Jazz Etudes that the students use to perform for their auditions. Anyway, so why do I write them? Why do I continue to submit them? Let's do some background here. I started writing these etudes in the 80s. We didn't call them etudes back then. Back then we called them written solos. They were written solos, and the idea was, and this was not from one educator, this was from a bunch of different educators. The idea was that when you write an etude, you're writing in slow motion what you wish you could do in real time. And the practice was to write a solo and memorize it and then forget it. And I remember we had a bunch of different guests come, wonderful guest artists. I don't put them on my resume because I was a student. I don't think that counts, right? But yes, so we had Bobby Shu, anyway, I'm not going to list them all, but we had a bunch of great, from high school in through college, a bunch of great educators, a bunch of great jazz musicians. And one of the techniques, and I'm not saying that they all taught this, but one of the techniques that they taught was write down what you wish you could play, memorize it, and then forget it. And yes, we called these written solos. And I never stopped doing that. I've been writing out written solos that whole time. I can't think of a time when I took a break from that. So we're talking 40 years worth of writing what we call today jazz etudes. And over the years, I've developed, it's funny because in other contexts, I'll tell people I don't believe in etudes. I'm fundamentally opposed to etudes. And then I have to say, but I've written hundreds of them. Some of them for myself, some of them for my students. I'm fundamentally opposed to etudes. However, there are times when they are what's most appropriate, if we could do all of that without etudes, that would be best. But because that's not practical, that's not an option, even though I'm fundamentally opposed to them, I still write them. What I'm saying now is not as true for the jazz stuff, but we're going to get to that, okay? So let's now be clear about this. When I wrote jazz etudes in the past, when I wrote these written solos, they were for me. They were devices that I was using to help me do what I wanted to do on a song. what you can, I believe that composition and improvisation are the same thing. It's just that improvisation happens in the moment. Writing out a solo is slow motion improv. Does that make sense? Writing out a solo or writing a jazz etude is slow motion improv. Now, after a while, I did begin to write etudes for my students. When did that happen? It was mid-90s, I think I started doing that. And the reason for that was I oftentimes had students that wanted to learn jazz but could not do transcriptions. They didn't have the technique to do a transcription yet. And when I say do, I mean practice. Even if I wrote it out for them, they couldn't play it yet. Now, I'm not talking all my students, of course not all. Some of my students were very, very advanced and didn't need that. But I did have beginners that wanted to learn jazz and just could not. The skill it took for them to play even the easiest transcriptions was way over their head. So I started writing jazz etudes based on, so it's the same idea, right? But instead of writing what I wanted to be able to sound like, I wrote what I wanted them to be able to sound like, always with the idea that down the road, they would take that as an example of how to write their own jazz etude, how to write their own written solo. So these, since the mid-90s, my written etudes have been part of my jazz teaching approach all this time. My students have been doing, and once again, I need to make it very, very clear, the jazz etudes that we were doing were, the end goal for that was for them to write their own. But, a lot of educators probably know what I'm talking about. You can't start beginner students on advanced projects. So yes, we do want them to do transcriptions. We do want them to write their own etudes. We want all of that. But they've got to get started somehow. They've got to get started. So yes, I'm not afraid to write stuff out for them. And over the years, instead of writing out a different one for each student, now I've got, for that tune, I've got a set of written solos. For that tune, I've got a set of written solos. And I've been collecting them all these years. So yes, the jazz etudes have been a big part of my approach, not just learning, but also the teaching for a long, long time. And, I teach four different kinds of, I think it's four different kinds of jazz etudes. Once again, the emphasis here is that eventually they will write their own. Eventually they will write their own. That's part of the reason why I haven't published any of these yet. The only jazz etudes I've published so far are my Giant Steps ones. I have a Giant Steps book. I think it's like over 70 Giant Steps etudes. But yeah, I haven't published these because that's, I might someday, but I won't publish them until I can make clear what the point is. I don't want people to study my etudes. I don't want them to master my etudes. I want them to use them as examples of how they should write their own. So in that light, I've got 4 different types of etudes. I have tendency tone etudes. Now these are etudes we use to learn the changes. There's other things we do to learn the changes, but tendency tone etudes are the etude side of it. Okay, then we have what I call a forced motif etude. A lot of people won't know what that is because I live in this bubble where I hear people talking about the language and the jazz language, and what they're talking about is something entirely foreign to what I teach. So I don't know what that divide is. It's almost as if, I watched a video one time, and the whole point of the video was a jazz educator saying that there is no such thing as jazz language, that every aspect of the music, and he lists it in the video, is the same in other styles of music. He just didn't happen to list motivic stuff. It's the motivic stuff that makes it jazz. It's the motivic stuff that makes it jazz language. And so when we talk about a forced motif etude, we take a motif, a jazz motif, something that you hear that and you're like, that's jazz. You take that motif and you force it everywhere it will go into the tune. I call it a forced motif jazz etude. Then we have the third one is a wish list etude. Those are the ones I was writing when I was younger. A wish list etude is what you wish you could play if in a real-time improvisation. If you write enough of those, memorize them, and throw them away, your improv will get closer and closer to where you want to be. And yes, there are motivic things all over the wish list etudes the way I do it. It's not just scales and arpeggios. Now, which brings us to the last type. Now, I don't do a lot of these, but it is a type. It's a type that's easy to write, hard to play, because it's not musical. Okay? The fourth type of jazz etude is a chord tone etude. A chord tone jazz etude, and that's a jazz etude where the source of your ideas comes from the chords. In other words, if it's a F minor 7, then the majority of the notes in that phrase that you write are going to be F minor 7 chord notes. You might have a passing tone. You might have some chromatic leading tones and stuff like that, but the source of the information is the actual chords. This is the worst kind of etude, and the hardest one to play, because there's no musical. See, when we base the etude on language, jazz language, when we base it on jazz language, it's never that hard to play. For that matter, it's not that hard for people to enjoy. People can sit down and listen and say, wow, that was a nice piece of music. Why? Because of the language. The language speaks. Chords and scales, they don't speak. And the same thing is true actually for improvisation. Language speaks. You can have somebody that's very, very technical. You can have some of that. And people will be impressed, but you won't speak to them. Now, there are people that have like a 50-50 mix. They have half language and half of that other stuff. That's amazing. That's the category I put Freddie Hubbard into. Freddie Hubbard has a lot of amazing language, and then he's got a lot of amazing other stuff that isn't language. the language itself pulls all of it together and makes it interesting. But if you have that other stuff without the language, it's not interesting at all. Anyway, I thought I would point that out. And why is it important for me to point that out? Is because when I decided to start writing these etudes, the initial reason was the all-state etudes that I had to teach my students at the time were written by guys who were doing those kinds of etudes, just chord tone etudes. And like I said, chord tone etudes, if I'm going to be spending hours and hours and hours and hours with my students working on that stuff, there's that old saying, be the change you want to see. Instead of just complaining about how unmusical that stuff is and how hard and awkward and all of that stuff is, and just not jazz. It's just, you can swing it all you want, it's not jazz. Just because you have notes from a chord of a song does not make it jazz. And you could put swing in there, you can put jazz rhythms in there, it's not jazz. And so with me having to teach this stuff to my students, I thought, well, why don't I just start submitting etudes? And initially I started with just one etude at a time. And then somewhere along the way I started submitting 3. And, so that was the initial reason. The initial reason was I didn't want to have to teach that other stuff to my students. But now, along the way, my teaching shifted. And I was no longer teaching any Texas students. Let's say it this way, Texas school-age students. So I wasn't teaching any students that were auditioning on this music. It looks like I'll have this year. I had 1 last year. And there was a time when I was thinking, why am I doing this now? Why am I contributing and spending time writing them? Why am I spending time sending them in and all that stuff? Why? If I'm not teaching that stuff anymore, why continue? And I had a lot of time to think about that. And I think the biggest reason is to give back to the community. I know that sounds like a cliche thing to say, give back to the community. But when I say give back to the community, it reminds me of Barry Lee Hall. If you've never heard of Barry Lee Hall, you look him up. He was at one point the leader of the Duke Ellington band. He moved back to Houston, and I got to work with him a bit. I even wrote a big band chart dedicated to him. And when I asked him why did he move back, he said that's why. He wanted to move back to Houston so he could give back to the community that got him started. And in a way, you could say that writing these etudes, it's like full circle, because I started off playing jazz in the Texas public schools. My first jazz experience was at Andrews High School under Al Mendez in the 80s. We did really, really well. And from there I went to UTEP and played it in the jazz band there. And so yes, jazz education from the Texas schools was part of how I got where I am. And so that's one of the reasons why I continued to still send the etudes in. today, most of my students are adults, and most of them are not in Houston. They're not even in Texas. I teach trumpet lessons as far east as France, as far north as Canada, as far south as Chile. We've got several in California, multiple different states. This hasn't happened yet, but someone just contacted us from India. So yes, we're doing lessons all over the world now. These students are not going to be auditioning on Texas All-State Jazz Etudes, right? So yes, this is, that said, I do enjoy writing the etudes. I enjoy hearing other people play my etudes. I enjoy knowing that I've helped, I don't know, it's going to sound arrogant, but helped at least elevate some of the materials that the students are playing. So yeah, to me, that makes it worth it. So did I miss anything? If you have any questions about Jazz Etudes and my background with how these things get written. Oh, by the way, rule number one when I'm writing a jazz etude is I never write it without my horn in my hand. I always play it first and then write it down. I do not just write what I think probably would sound good. No, if I don't play it and it sounds good, then I scrap it. So I always, and most of the time, the process is that I'll put the track on. Oh, and that's the other thing, is when I'm writing an etude, I write it with the track. And I'll start off the process by improvising over that tune for a while. So I'll put the track on, I'll improvise, and then when I do something that sounds like, hey, that's a good opener, I'll go with that. Now it's something I just improvised. Then I'll write that down, and now I start the track again, I play what I just wrote, and then I improvise after that. And I'll improvise 5, 6, 7, maybe a dozen different things until I find something that matches what I wrote down already. And I just repeat that process till I have an etude. And that's how I write every etude, whether it's for my students or for the all-state stuff. The all-state stuff is a little bit different from what I write for my students for a number of reasons. The biggest reason being the requirements that they have. They do tell us what they need, and I make sure that those requirements are in there. And there's some other editorial kind of things that I try to observe for them. Those editorial things are not as important to me, but I understand that they're important to them. So I think I've been doing, this year, they chose 2 of my etudes and didn't ask for any corrections. So I take that as a good sign. So anyway, yeah, if you have any questions about this, please feel free to ask. And otherwise, God bless you, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you.